Right. So an organization, this is management accounting quick test two. So let's jump right in. So an organization will typically have let's just come to its, say its factory. It will have a number of departments within the factory that um, deal with making the final product. I mean, ultimately, all costs have to go into the products. So, like we said, for responsibility purposes, an organization will break up its organization into functional areas or departments or cost centers, if you like, if you want to call it like that. So you'd have your production cost centers. I'll call that A and B, where the different products are being made. So this might be department A. You're making bicycles here, you're making hats. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. In fact, it might be the same product going through different process. Same one product going through mixing and molding, that sort of thing. But then you'll also have other departments that kind of support that. So maybe maintenance, if you like. But they're not actually making products, if you like, but they also have overheads. So you can see that it would be wonderful if we didn't have these, but if we just had these two, then we would just take those overheads and just divide them by the products in A and B. But we have overheads here, so we still have to kind of, but A and B will have their own overheads. So A will have its own overheads. It'll have its own overheads. So, for example, it might be its own salaries, for example, maybe, and B will have its own salaries, for example. So these overheads are very clearly marked for A and B. We know them, they're here. They're related directly to A and B, but then you can have salaries, of course, to do with C, D, and E. So the question here is then how do you then you're thinking, right, I have to get these guys in here, right? You're thinking, well, I can't stop here because ultimately I need to get these costs into A and B because this is where the products are. Because ultimately we're trying to find the full cost, aren't we? The full cost of each product, so we can then get the margin and then sell it. So the technical term, right, for when we know that we can charge a cost directly to, it's still overheads, because we don't talk about allocation with direct costs. No, we don't, because it's just what it is. Clearly, we see that, but we're talking about overheads here. So yes, where we can clearly locate a fixed cost, sorry, an overhead to a particular cost center, we call that allocation. But then when you now have these C, D, and E, because they do work for A and B, and then we now need to we reassess it, or if you like, share it, so to speak. I mean, this could have been rent, if you like. We need to share it because A and B might have their own warehouses, and C, D, and E, if you like, have rent costs as well. So when I say rent, this is this specific rental costs in this case. But the key point here is that, or it could have been, oh, it doesn't matter. Key point here is when we have to resplit all of this, we then reapportion, and that's what that is. So the answer here is A. Again, like I'll do this in two in sets of twos, so maybe to do a bit of expanding on them. Um, and really, the process of charging production overheads to cost units. So now all the goods, all the costs are in here. So we've got all of this from here to here, moved it all into this. So we now have A and B, and we now have this big cost, maybe 50,000, 100,000. That's what they're asking here. I've got all the costs now in the production I've got everything now. These are where the cost units are. The question is, how do I now spread this cost over these units? Maybe there are 10,000 units here, maybe there are 5,000 units here. And really, ultimately, this is a process of absorbing. So the general principle in general is very much about absorbing the costs over those units. And that's really the principle. So what we then go on and study is, well, this cost here, I mean, it might be a case that, um, if you like, I mean, if the question here is, this is just a general overhead, I've just spread it over the units. But again, I might have, if you like, a situation where I'm making several products. So, for example, I might be making hats and bicycles and shoes, and this will take So I'll have an overhead, maybe for example, of 50,000. I know this has to be absorbed. The question here is what is the best way of absorbing it or splitting this 50,000 between hats, bicycles, and shoes? That's the question. What's the best way of splitting it? That's why we keep on expanding the concept of overhead absorption. So overhead absorption is the overall heading. The question here is maybe I could now look at the activity and say, well, actually, I'm going to use our well, an overhead absorption is very much based on direct labor and direct machine hours. So, for example, I could say, okay, overhead absorption just says, okay, listen, this took 500 hours, this took 100 hours, this took 400 hours. So split this 50,000 based on those hours. This might be machine hours as well. But I might be able to break this down a little and say, well, actually, this 50,000 is made up of a number of overheads. You can see. So the key point here is I'm now just in the vicinity of the products. So that's 50,000. Okay, that 50,000 is made up of some setup costs. So you can see I'm breaking up the overheads to really set up costs, procurement, really breaking it up and looking for the activity, the real activity driving the overhead. Because you see, with traditional absorption costing, I assume that the main driver of the overhead are hours, whether machine hours or labor hours. And that's typically the case when you're making large volumes, because typically volumes are driven by hours drive volume, if you like. But when you're making smaller volumes, you might need to, and you're having these large overheads. When you have very little volumes, maybe you had 5 and 2 and 1, you have to be thinking, I'm looking at really complex technological production here. So this isn't about labor or machine anymore. It's about the filtering or the distillation of this overhead. This might be quality inspections and things like that. And just if you're making one item, maybe this thing is really precious. So you want to make sure you allocate correctly the overhead to that thing, which is why we now break up this 50,000 carefully. And that's where we talk about activity based costing. What's the activity really driving it? Cool, great stuff. So, but anyway, the answer here was D. Okay, great stuff. See you in the next 2 questions.